Great to see so many of you jumping in today for our conversation. I am Shelley Rogers, and I am part of the web team here at Liberty Fund. It's our pleasure to have you join us today for the latest installment of From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Before I turn it over to Arnold and our distinguished guest, Alberto Mingardi, I'd like to invite everybody towards the end of the conversation to ask live questions. If you would like to do so, please use the Q&A feature or the raise hand feature, and I will pop you in so that you can ask your question to our panelists. Arnold?
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to welcome Alberto. We've known each other for quite a while, but haven't seen each other in quite a while. He's the man behind the Bruno Leone Institute. Bruno Leone, an Italian libertarian, and I think Alberto and I have had to watch, sadly, our respective governments, his in Italy and mine in the United States, move quite in the opposite direction of liberty over the years. So we're here to discuss a book by Michael Tomasello, who's an evolutionary biologist or primatologist. And I think we both have to admit that it's a difficult book to follow. He's trying to reach a lay audience, so with perhaps some success, but perhaps not complete success. I guess to summarize, what interested me about the book was the way he takes the view that human brains evolved in order to enable us to work together in some sense, to coordinate. And of course, coordination is a big issue in economics and liberty. And so it was interesting, there are all these theories of how, of why the human brain evolved the way it did, or how it did, or what makes us different. And it was just interesting to see the focus on coordination and collaboration. So I thought that, so that's what I found most interesting about the book. I think what I found most difficult is being able to follow along with Tomasello on these stages of evolution. So he has sort of this hierarchy, let's say humans at the top, great apes below that, other mammals below that, and then small vertebrates below that. With each stage, he says, faced a new environmental complexity or difficulty and evolved a brain capability of dealing with it. So with the small vertebrates, they didn't know they weren't just handed their food. So they had to actively look for food. They needed to what Tomasello calls agency, which means having a goal and making some deliberate choices to get to that goal. Then you get to the small mammals, and getting to the food may require a bit of a plan, a bit of deciding what you're going to do in a sequence. And that requires a further brain capacity. And then we get to the great apes, and that requires sort of consciously monitoring whether your plan is working. By the way, I'm going to be a little hazy on that because I'm just a little hazy on his description of the great apes in general. But that requires a further evolution of the brain to have some sort of executive function, understand what I'm doing and how it's affecting my ability to get to the goal. And then finally, you get to the human, where the main difference is to be able to have shared agency. We can try to do something together, and that leads to all sorts of capabilities of being able to manipulate each other, be able to communicate with each other, be able to base our decisions based on repeated interactions with one another. And then from that point, I would say things really take off. I mean, here we are doing something that is just far beyond the capability of an ape, talking over an electronic device, communicating in very abstract terms. And that's the stage of cultural evolution, which is sort of made possible by the stepping up to the human capabilities of being able to do shared things. So, Alberto, what do you make of this concept of shared agency? Did that appeal to you as a way of talking about human beings and kind of what we're all about evolutionarily?
Well, Arnold, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation to embarrass myself in dealing with a book I do not fully understand, but I found very fascinating. And also, I want to say to Tom Gray that I did attend that meeting. He asked a question and I tried to answer, but I'm totally Zoom stupid, regardless of, now quite some time of practicing Zoom. I found the book fascinating, and perhaps I thought that the parts of Tomasello's work that interested me the most were actually the parts related with the early stage of development. I found, first of all, very interesting the key observation of the book, at least to me, which is Tomasello thinks that evolutionary theory is deficient in dealing with individual agency. And instead, is proposing us to look at individual agency besides evolution as a macro phenomenon, so to say. He has, if I remember it right, a very nice sentence about Darwin's birds, and in each of them having individual agency and showing different kind of behaviors. And also I found that the whole idea of a feedback mechanism, which is not just responding to incentive, but is reacting to the circumstances and developing your own behavior, and then adapting to the outcome of your behavior as, what basically he thinks characterizes the evolutionary journey of what came before the human being. I thought it was an interesting insight, was an interesting point to me. When it comes to the issue of shared agency that you pointed out, Arnold, it seems to me, but I'm not really sure if that is something that is actually more clarifying or more making things more complex in his account. On the one hand, it resonates, the point that you made also in your piece, and if I'm right, more or less the article in the beginning of your piece, which is humans are the only species that can conceptualize agency and sharing goals and agreeing upon what to do. On the other hand, I think there are many layers in Tomasello's thesis, and I'm not very, some of the things he points out are hardwired in us by evolutionary forces. Some of it is acquired and developed through culture. I'm not really sure I got all the nuances of shared agency, and particularly what he sometimes called the development into, if I'm right, cultural being. So as human being able not just to agree on an immediate goal, but to have shared conceptual maps or a shared understanding of the world outside of us. Another point which I thought was perhaps interesting for people like you, but up to a certain extent also me, spent a lot of time thinking about economics, was his emphasis that the feedback mechanism is not exclusively about incentives. That even the most simple of organism behind us, in our same evolutionary lines, so to say, it is not merely reactive to incentive, but it has, some sort of a map of the world surrounding it. And I thought that that may be something which is worth to repeat to economics undergrads, that incentives are not, these very, very simple concepts.
Yeah, well, he says, even a squirrel doesn't just say, well, there's a food over here, there's a nut over here, I'm going to go in that direction. It may have to form a plan and say, well, is this going to get me there? Or whoops, something's blocking me. Or maybe the way I went last time didn't work. So the emphasis on the feedback is right. So you started to say that you found the description of going up the ladder, the first steps, most interesting. You want to elaborate a bit on that?
Well, first of all, I thought it was, I'm a dilettante on these. I have a certain familiar with evolutionary argument when it comes to groups of human beings, but I cannot say I do really go beyond that. I thought, the idea of an evolutionary ladder going up to humans and his investigation in that line, I thought was helpful, in bringing some clarity in a debate in which you're very often bringing in all sorts of different species, in a sort of, desperate attempt to add arguments in favor of the theory on. But you're missing, the idea that this selection is going through a ladder, is progressing, if we may use this word, in a particular story. So I thought that was helpful conceptually. Of course, I don't want to give the impression that he thinks that somehow evolution is in any sense necessary or teleologically following a path, but he's looking back at the story from the vantage point of the human being, and he's thinking about the issue of agency, as going up in. He wouldn't use the word consciousness. I think he used sentient sometime, but never conscious, because of course for a psychologist these days, conscious is a very complicated concept and has a lot of baggage somehow. But you go up, somehow in clarity of your perception and perhaps width of your perception of the world outside of yourself, up to the last point, up to now, which is us, where we do have this ability of distinguishing between subjective perception of reality and the existence of a reality down there. But I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was also very interesting, this emphasis of somehow this feedback mechanism becoming more complex and more accurate in a sense, when you go up the evolutionary ladder, but being, in its elementary silhouette, that feedback mechanism.
Yeah, I think that may be in some sense the most complicated, hard to convey part of the book, is that you kind of get increasing self-awareness in some sense, and like you say, he stays away from the term consciousness, but he sort of talks around it in a lot of ways, so as you move up that ladder, people come, or not people, but organisms become more and more aware of what their actions are doing. So you get to the point of the vertebrate is just aware that, well, there's food this way, so I'll go this way rather than that way. Squirrel is aware that, well, I'm actually going to make a decision to go this way, or maybe we'll go around this way or jump off of this branch. And so it's making, it's more aware of things, and it gets more types of feedback about whether it's actually achieving its goal or not. And then you move up to the apes, and here's where I get a little lost in sort of all the capabilities of the apes, the great apes, to kind of understand that they sort of understand that there are other beings in the world, and they're actually able to make decisions, and this is going to affect me and whether I can get to this food or not, if someone else is trying to get to it first. And then you get to humans, and humans can, have even more feedback loops and more awareness of, well, if I point to this, then the other person will see it, and maybe we can both do something together, and maybe I can direct the other person to do something, and while I do something different, and we can get the food. And it's that, that sort of, in some sense, the beginning of the human as a cultural animal, is that being aware that there is this other person who I can kind of manipulate in some way, and I know that I'm manipulating, I know that I'm pointing, and I know that they're responding. So again, like you say, it's sort of talking very close to talking about consciousness, but in sort of more, trying to be, I guess, a little bit more specific about the way you get feedback and the way you try to manipulate the other person. But so then that, I think, where that leads to with humans is this, all the games that we play to try to manipulate one another, and all the ways we try to avoid being manipulated against our interest. And then later, he says, you get this evolution into larger groups of people where you're starting to set up norms and institutions to try to carry out this shared agency. So that, I guess, what I'd say is that we've evolved brains to enable us to cooperate, but that doesn't mean that we're somehow evolved to be cooperators, right? We've evolved brains that are capable of dealing with each other, manipulating each other in a way that we cooperate. That doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think he would at all use the phrase natural cooperators.
No, in a sense, I thought, it was interesting. The manipulation point was one of the most famous contemporary theorists about human cooperation and the mind is Trivers, who of course talks about deception and attempts to deceive yourself as basically give it a go before you get out and try to manipulate others to go your way. And so you come up with the problems we do have in telling ourselves stories, which are nonetheless evolved in order to they satisfy the evolutionary purposes at a certain point, but they may be problems these days. I agree with you that it's difficult to in this perspective to see humans as naturally somehow cooperating in in a sense of the word which is not a trick, which is not just a byproduct of the way in which we evolved. I thought, this was a consequence of this main idea. It was trying to integrate individual agency in an evolutionary account. Because if you take the evolutionary account and you look at groups, you have lots to say in favor of cooperation. A certain degree of cooperation, a certain degree of complexity in cooperation in the division of labor and so on and so forth, typically makes the group more likely to grow and reproduce and have success. That's the basic argument advanced by Hayek in The Fatal Conceit. And I suppose, in these very broad lines, it is still true. It is still all as true or sensible by most contemporary cognitive psychologist or evolutionary scholar. But when you get into individual agency, you need to focus on a different set of motivation, and somehow you go down to once again some hardwired motives that are basically the drive to personal, quote unquote, biological success. I have to say another thing that that at first shocked me about the book, but I don't know, of course, if I really understood it. But these emphases somehow, if you want to put it in a different way, there's a lot of emphasis upon being in control, or better, feeling in control, feeling on top of this feedback mechanism rather than being a passive actor. And of course, when you read this, you need to keep in mind that he's talking about the single individual and its circumstances, and not of humankind, taking the reins of history into its hands. There's that famous passage by Marx in Das Kapital, when he says that, you can compare the bee and the spider and the human being. And, it's an example that actually Tomasello uses in the beginning of his book, that bees and spiders can actually contrive fairly complex artifacts, but they lack mentality or intentions or consciousness. It's the same point that Marx made in Das Kapital, saying that, the bee may be a very brilliant architect, but it's not a brilliant architect because it's lacking intention and understanding. And of course, that's the human feature, and that's a feature of the worker. And at a certain point, humankind is supposed to do the same with the world. I mean, remaking the world as people remade nature. But I think, Tomasello is clearly not making that point. He's just looking at it from the perspective of the single individual agent and of what constitutes basically evolutionary success at that level and not at the species level. Of course, there are repercussions, but my understanding of the book is that it's trying to understand the dynamic of individual, not action, but agency.
Yeah, I think that's right. And everything else beyond that, is sort of becomes a study of culture, which I think is sort of beyond what he wants to do, right? So he's saying this is what the individual has to work with in terms of brain capability, and now, later on, somebody can look at how that interacts with other people and how cultures evolve, how people can try to have goals that go way beyond that seem to be way beyond their individual goals. They can have, they can at least articulate goals for the whole world, like you say. Okay, Shelley, I think we're coming up to about a point where we ought to let the audience come in. Do we have some questions yet?
We do. I'm going to allow John Alcorn to come in. He had quite a few questions.
Okay.
John, if you'd like to unmute, perfect.
Hello to both of you, and thank you for the conversation. My first question is the following: is shared agency peculiar to humans? I ask because it seems, for example, that dog and man have shared agency in hunting. Sheep and man have shared agency in herding. Perhaps pigeon and man have shared agency in the delivery of messages. Well, you see where I'm going.
Yeah.
The interspecies shared agency. Another way to ask the question would be, separate species from humans. The Canadian beaver creates an ecology of swamps. Now, each individual beaver apparently is focusing on a nuclear family, a remarkable architect. I think of the beaver as like an architect, like a Roman architect without the rule of law, but their constructions taken together create an ecology where each of them thrive in an interdependent way with separate nuclear families. Anyway, is shared agency really peculiar to humans?
Well, I won't try to outguess Tomasello on that one. I think what he'd say about the human and the dog is that it's it's more of a training conditioning of the dog rather than sort of communicating and suggesting and having mutual feedback to what you do this, you do that. One of the things that he gives as an example of shared agency is being able to switch roles. And he says, two young children can switch roles, but two chimpanzees could never do that. And it's hard to imagine the human and the dog or the human and the sheep switching roles.
I think you're right. By the way, I want to thank John for his beautiful summary in the Q&A section. I thought it was very good. I think it's a matter of training. In a sense, I suppose that one thing that comes with our reflective state of mind is also something that humans tend to do very, very easily, which is searching for similar patterns in the behavior of other species, in the behavior of other things, a sort of anthropomorphization of animals, which is one of the ways in which we tell stories to ourselves in many sense. But since another of the question was mentioning Smith, I think that Tomasello won't have much of a quarrel with Smith's point that exchange is something exclusively for humans, and dogs are unable to trade one bone with another.
John, did you have some more questions?
Well, I did have one other. I hope it's not too abstract. It's about the relationship between shared agency and consciousness. I start from three intuitions, which are simple. One is that shared agency requires that organisms have mental states about one another's mental states. And the second intuition is that many species of animals, this is an empirical one, many species of animals seem to have mental states about one another's mental states.
Yeah, Tomasello would say that, yes.
at least about emotions. And then, but thirdly, a human has something more for sure. And that's second order mental states about her own mental states, beliefs about our beliefs, beliefs about our own emotions, and so on. You know, my dog might feel shame at being reprimanded or envy at another dog's bone, but my dog won't feel shame at having been envious. So I guess my question then is, what kind of do some higher animals have this kind of second order mental states or consciousness? What kind of shared agency requires these second order mental states, being aware of one's own mental states, not just that, you know, another organism has mental states?
Yeah, I don't know if Alberto was able to glean the answer from the book. I would have trouble actually, because it sounds like he describes great apes as having something close to these second order mental states. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And yet, you know, great apes are not capable of shared agency. Yeah, that was one of the things that I just found difficult. Do you pull anything out from that, Alberto?
Well, I think that perhaps one point that we need to consider is language, which is something that is very important to Tomasello, also due to his previous work. And I suppose that, you know, these different ladders of mental states require something like language. Which is, in a sense, you know, the true difference between us and other mammals that tend to be, you know, producing sounds that may be communicating in some way, but that never reach the sort of complexity in expressing themselves to their kin that we reached.
Let me just read from the book. He says that developing the capacity to form a joint agency with a rational partner, this required 3 sets of adaptations not possessed by great apes. First, humans need to be able to form with one another a joint goal superseding their individual goals, which required both cognitive and motivational adaptations. So to be able to form a joint goal that supersedes individual goals. Second, sorry, it's across multiple pages. Okay, second, they needed to coordinate their individual roles in the collaborative activity, which required new forms of perspective taking and cooperative communication. So that gets to the fact that you need to be able to switch roles in some sense. And third, they needed to have ways of keeping everything on track in the collaboration, even in the face of unanticipated exigencies, by working together to cognitively control the collaboration from one or another executive level, which required new mechanisms of social self-regulation. So I would say maybe the example of being able to be flexible in terms of roles is, you know, sort of an operational distinction between humans and any other animals. You know, sort of what, but it's hard to pin down that to any one brain function, because, you know, he keeps using the words, you know, general words, general sets of adaptations and abilities and motivations. He doesn't just point it down to one, which makes it a little more difficult.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Luis. If you can unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thanks very much for the discussion today. I just finished reading Tomasello's book, on the evolution of agency, and I'm glad for the opportunity to hear your thoughts about it. And my thought came when Tomasello mentioned in, I believe, the last chapter, the Dunbar number. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, or yes, that's the maximum size of a group of not only humans, but also primates, which can interact with each other on a regular basis and get to know each other regularly. Given what Tomasello says about cooperation as required shared agency, I've often thought that the reason that humans can't come together and cooperate on really existential problems like climate change is that we're way, way beyond our Dunbar number, which is to say the number that we've been used to having cooperation in for most of our existence as a species. And I like your thoughts on that idea of
I've always emphasized the Dunbar number a lot. That we have an intimate world of people that we deal with on a regular basis, and we have a remote world of like celebrities, politicians, and so on. And those are historically separate. Another instance is informal versus formal. That is, if you have a small business that's where the number of people is below the Dunbar number, you don't need an organization chart. You don't need a process for bringing people on board. You don't need an employee manual. But all those things become necessary when you get over the Dunbar number. In terms of overall cooperation, there's one view that we've only evolved the ability to cooperate in groups in a competitive sort of situation. That is, we can only cooperate when there's an enemy, and we cooperate in trying to overcome the enemy. So that view would explain why the attempt to come up with a worldwide cooperation effort, we haven't evolved to do that.
Yes, I don't have much to add. I mean, clearly there is a mismatch between the sort of environment in which we evolved our brains and the environment where we live now, and this is why we tend to keep dear all sorts of beliefs that were reasonable in much smaller community and set of human beings, and they're not necessarily in an extended order or in an open society or anyway in a society in which the population is counted in millions in a country and not in dozens. I mean, some people think, for example, that even conspiracy theories, for example, are signaling this mismatch. We evolve by looking at visible ends, and then we get into abstract societies, and there are many processes in which visible ends aren't there, and we look for hidden ends. And try to find, well, I don't know if it is the right word to use in the context of this discussion, agency where it's not there. Michael Shermer, in his work on conspiracy theory uses two words. One is agenticity, which is this tendency of finding agency everywhere. And the other one is patternicity, the tendency of identifying patterns in all sorts of contexts and dimension of social life. I suppose one can argue that these are cases of mismatch from our evolutionary past to the wider and more complex, more populated world we live in now.
Yeah, and thanks for that. I appreciate that. The other part is that there's a fellow named Christakis who has written a book on the social suite, and one of the points that he makes is that humans are going to continue to evolve, but now we have no threats from predators in the environments. We're surrounded mostly by other people. So therefore, looking at it simplistically, we will have to evolve in the direction of greater and greater ability to cooperate, as Chardin suggests in The Phenomenon of Man.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I think Tomasello would say that very, many, thousands of years ago, we became the most, that humans became the most difficult adversary, the most complicated adversary
Yes.
that we have. All right. Shelley, do we have some?
We do.
Another
We
one?
have two more. Our next attendee would like to make a comment is Dennis.
Hi, thank you for this discussion. I'm a big fan of Tomasello. I haven't read this book, but I did read his earlier one on the origin of human communication. And in reading Arnold's review, I didn't get too far into the opening paragraph where he says other species might occasionally engage in cooperative behavior, but they are not aware that they are doing so. And that immediately brought to mind Adam Smith, because isn't cooperative behavior with lack of awareness that it is taking place the sort of the essence of the invisible hand? And I wonder if Tomasello gets into that. And I guess I'd be further interested in your views on the relative importance of shared agency versus this sort of unaware agency that takes place in economics, where we cooperate without knowing that we're doing that.
Yeah, well, that brings up an issue that I've been talking about quite a bit recently, of sort of intentions versus consequences. You can think of two extreme views, which is only looking at intentions, in which case sort of shared agency would just mean we have to be doing things where, we both intend the same thing, and your intentions have to be good. Consequentialism would say, I don't care why you did something, this is what the consequences turned out to be. So I don't care why the butcher and the baker, wanted it. I don't care why the butcher wanted to trade meat for me. I just know that the consequences was a good trade. So I guess, it's probably that, the right intuition is somewhere in between, looking extreme, just only at intentions, only at consequences. But I think you're right that when consequences break from intentions, the issue of shared agency becomes more complicated, right? I have to know intellectually that a competitive economy is good for me, even though the intentions of everyone around me are self-interested and selfish. That requires sort of another layer of being able to think of shared agency. The shared agencies, we belong in a competitive economy. It isn't that you want to give me meat and I want to give you bread. It's different from that.
Well, I agree with everything that Arnold said, but if I'm right in interpreting Dennis' question as, should we choose between Adam Smith and Tomasello? Well, I'm not so sure we need to, because I think, the focus of this book is on individual agency. And certainly, the Samsung worker is not aware that this is contributing, his small piece in the production of a cell phone that ultimately goes to my benefit. But he has a contract and he knows he's entering into a purposeful production of something. He just ignores the ramification of it and how much wider the cooperation is. But at the level of agency, this book is talking about, is talking about, purposeful agreements by people that basically decide to act on a local basis, if we may say so. When it comes to allowing for the, I don't think Tomasello would like the word, but still the unconscious consequences of human interactions. Well, I think this is exactly where cultural norms should step in, allowing people, to have interaction that may be in their own mind relatively exclusively to what they want to do, but they have much wider consequences that span, over the world or over generations, perhaps. So that's the cultural level in the sense of following consuetudinary norms. People are not precisely aware of why they're following them. That allows, these wider consequences of cooperation. But of course, any single individual, and this is the beauty of the system, but of course, is also the problem of the system, if you want to say so, because nobody really understands what are the benefits of a wider division of labor, of the market economy, not to mention globalization and so on and so forth. But in this system, any and each of the actor is somehow acting for himself, herself, using the sort of agency Tomasello referred to. I don't know if I made myself even vaguely clear.
Yeah, no, I think you did. And I think Tomasello even talks a bit about this, that, as you get really above the Dunbar number, these social norms become more important in kind of steering individual agency in a direction that, works out well for people. So, you don't, you need rules so that people aren't stealing when they can kind of get away with it, or just defecting in a game theory sense when they can get away with it. So Shelley, we have another one still?
We do. Our last question is from Tom Gray.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, hi. That was a great lead-in, actually, Arnold, because you haven't really talked too much about the punishment of cheaters, or how to stop the free riders, or how Tomasello is talking about that in his book on cooperation. Because I was looking up some of his other writings or reviews, and they talk about how children are automatically cooperative and altruistic, but the children are not happy with cheaters. So I was wondering what he says in this book about stopping the cheaters.
I don't recall. Sorry?
I think very little in this book.
Yeah, no, I think other people have talked about that. And of course, that's clearly something that would would have to evolve if shared agency is going to work. I think, he does say that, as that people have that, let's say you're hunting together, you do have to adapt to what one another is doing. And I think maybe he's explicit that, but certainly implicit is that you don't want to have a hunt that's successful and then the other person takes everything. He says chimpanzees behave exactly that way. That is, they may go on a joint foraging expedition, but when they find the food, it's every chimp for itself. There's no sharing. There's no sense that, well, we're going to be doing this again tomorrow, so maybe we ought to behave nicely today. Whereas humans seem pretty much born with this sense of right and wrong when it comes to something like that, or a sense of someone's violating the norms. So maybe that's going to affect our relationship tomorrow. And that's kind of a key part of the difference between the human and the ape, is that we do think about relationships that way. So if we go hunting together and we find something and you immediately take all of it, there are going to be consequences for you. If nothing else, I'm not going to go hunting with you tomorrow. So I think he at least touches on that aspect of cheating in that sense.
Thank you. I'm wondering if I could also ask about online game playing, which to me seems like part of the evolution that we're going through, where, you mentioned the three things about the joint goals and the progress, and specifically with respect to men versus women and the Dunbar number. And it seems to me, as I'm reading some of these feminization issues, that it might be that men are more used to doing more coordination in sports with larger numbers of people and doing more cooperation. So they want a social norm that is more optimal for their team, whereas possibly women are more interested in the sub-Dunbar number groups and very, very interested in the individuals in those sub-Dunbar number groups. So for instance, if there's a criminal in the family, they're very interested in trying to be nice to the criminal and being positive. And I'm wondering if Tomasello talks about that, any male-female differences in cooperation.
As far as I remember, he does not. Do you remember any? No, I don't think so.
I don't remember. He gets into that ear.
Yeah, you have to go to Joyce Bennons and others for differences in the sort of the evolution of cooperation between men and women and how they might have evolved differently on that.
One point which is very much on the side, but I thought was, it perhaps is interesting to take into account in this concept, in this context, is that right at the beginning, Tomasello has some, slightly polemical words for approaches like Kahneman. So this idea that we search for instances of irrationality in human behavior. And on the other hand, he sides with his Max Planck colleague Gerd Gigerenzer, who repeatedly emphasized in a number of books that so-called non-rational biases are actually very likely to be evolutionary adaptations. And I suppose that has also something to do with a way to better understanding the division of labor between sexes, for example, not as something that points to the deficient understanding of reality on the part of men and women, but as the output of evolutionary strategies that were winning in the particular context in which they took place in the past. But I think it's a very small signal to establish some deduction upon it.
Okay,
We have one more question if you guys have just another minute. John
Okay.
has one additional question.
It's a general question, I guess about method. Is evolutionary psychology getting ahead of the evidence? Does evolutionary psychology rely too much on just so stories? Concepts like Dunbar number, shared intention, so on. These are, there's conception. The concepts may be precise, but it's hard to and deep. But to move from the concepts to integrate them with the history of species, it's a tall order. It's difficult. You can't run systematic experiments. There's just the one body of history. You see where I'm going with this. There are a lot of books now in evolutionary psychology, just as there were in sociobiology back in the 80s and 90s, and is there more theory than evidence?
Alberto, do you want to take a first step on that?
My guess on that, and it's a very superficial answer, as typically the answer I attempted to give tonight, is that we tend to read, at least I tend to read, as you pointed out, books in evolutionary psychology or social biology in the past. And, these books are packaged as attempts to present arguments to the layman. They do rely anyway on stronger evidence from modern history, I suppose, archaeology, paleontology, and some lab experiments. So I think I don't think you're necessarily right when it comes to evolutionary psychology per se. I think you're absolutely right when you come to the drafting and writing of an evolutionary psychology book that aims to go beyond an audience of experts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that I'll go with that answer as well.
Well, gentlemen, I think that brings us to the end. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, especially Alberto. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
your time. I hope everybody can join us for the next installment from the shelf on June 15th from noon to 1 Eastern Standard Time. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Alberto. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody, really.
All right.